Hello everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel, Kalanati. Today I'm going to talk about my favorite books of 2021, probably in briefer fashion than I was originally planning on. I have been trying to film this video for weeks and it hasn't happened because, as you may know, things are kind of crazy and busy and all that in my life right now. And then, as it turns out, the one weekend where I clear my schedule so I can catch up on filming and all this stuff, I'm sick again. I was sick right before Christmas and I'm pretty sure I have a cold again, so not feeling super hot today, but I'm going to push through and get this done so that something is out there. But that is why this is probably going to be a bit more rapid fire, because I don't want to lose my voice talking too much because that's horrible. So without much further ado, here are my favorite books of 2021 plus a couple of honorable mentions. I don't rank my favorite books. Please don't ask me to do that. I cannot rank favorites in any way. But I'm going to talk about the favorites in the order in which I read them throughout the year, and then a handful of honorable mentions in just whatever jumbled fashion that I want to discuss them. There's no particular reason for where I did the cutoff between favorites and honorable mentions. It just sort of fell in there somewhere and I'm not gonna overthink it. So with that kind of lame introduction, let's talk about the books. This first one, I'm pretty sure, is the only book on this list that I haven't talked about before, and that is Spectred Isle by K.J. Charles. I read this back in January of 2021 when I was kind of on a hiatus and I didn't discuss any of the books that I read during that time. The funny thing is that this book has the distinction of being the only book I have ever read twice within a month. I read it like, I think January 1st or something, and then I went around and I read it again right in February, so I obviously really enjoyed it. And I had to put it on this list of favorites because I keep thinking about it throughout the year. I read it twice this past year and I want to read it again and again. It's not the most amazing thing, but I think, as you might tell from a lot of the books that are coming up on this list, it was a year of reading things that made me feel good. And that's exactly what this book did. So Spectred Isle is queer historical romance with a major fantasy element. It's about two men after World War I in England. And of course they meet and fall in love, but there's also this like impending magical doom thing. It's a little bit Lovecraftian in a way, I think. And also it has this really fascinating world building and magic system that I think is taken straight out like Green Man mythology. And I never really read anything quite like the magical world building in this. And I loved the combination with historical romance. It was just so good. And I appreciated it even more when I reread it. I think that K.J. Charles has this masterful buildup of the characters' relationship, all the little hints about them and their growing attraction to each other, and then just like the actual plot, what they're fighting against, and what has happened with the kind of like magical family in the story. It was so interesting. So I loved this. We'll definitely return to it again and again. Next, there are two books that I've already done reviews on, so I will refer you to those videos if you want to know a lot more of my thoughts on them and what they're about. One is Winterkeep by Kristin Cashore. This is the fourth or fifth Graceling Realm book, and I knew it was going to be solid. I've never been disappointed by any of the Graceling books. They've always been so good, and to get another one after such a long wait after Bitter Blue, I was super excited about this, and I loved the book. Maybe I had some reservations about one of the characters who I thought was a little bit unlikable, but I feel like these books always have something good to say, a message, and something that I take to heart, and Winterkeep was no exception. And then of course there is The Relentless Moon by Robinette Kowal. This is the third Lady Astronaut novel, though it does move to another character's perspective. This is a book that I found initially kind of slow and challenging to get into, and it turned into a really interesting experience where I felt like I love the story, I love this world, this alternate history. This is the kind of science fiction I love, but I was like interrogating my own experience, reacting to the main character throughout the whole story, because I tend to find this main character unlikable, but this was such a good example of a book where the unlikable character makes it more interesting in a way. Anyway, I'm always going to love the Lady Astronaut novels, and this is another one where Kowal just knocked it out of the park. Another fun, almost like comfort read is, of course, Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. This is the Murderbot novella we got in 2021, and it's basically this like standalone murder mystery investigation where Murderbot has to work with the like human security to investigate the death of a stranger there, and I loved it. I mean, I love Murderbot in just like investigative mode and complaining about humans while helping them. It's so good all the time. I just, once again, never disappointed by Murderbot. I don't think I need to say much more about it than that because this is such a sensation for a reason. It has been a while, I think, since I had a short story collection on a favorites list, or at least I feel like they don't often rank as highly. Short story collections just can be so variable, like anthologies, but there is one that absolutely stands out from this last year for me, and it is Never Have I Ever by Isabel Yap. This is probably the biggest shocker on this list because this is mostly dark fantasy and horror. And that is not my thing most of the time, but this collection was just magnificent. Every story in this was so good. Even if a few of them weren't exactly to my taste, they were interesting. They were well written. Like, Isabel Yap knows how to work within the short story format and puts this little twist on everything. My favorite story in this is, of course, the sweet romantic one that is not horror in any way, because that's me. But this overall was so good and I highly recommend it. Next is Defekt by Nino Cipri. I admit I was a bit surprised at how much this one touched me. I wasn't really expecting that. I was expecting like IKEA style interdimensional portal hijinks, and then I got this story which was very much about realizing one's identity, and it was so good. So this is another absolute favorite of the year and has solidified Nino Cipri as an author I'm just going to be looking forward to all the time now. I do, of course, need to have a nonfiction book or two that kind of, I don't know, stands in for all the other things I was interested in the year. So definitely The Fabric of Civilization by Virginia Postrel had to be on my list. This pretty much summarizes a lot of my interest in like fiber arts and textiles this year. I started to read more about that and the history of it and started to get super into the crafting aspects of that. So this is a fantastic book that really dives into how textiles drove innovation in technology just in general. We tend to think of textiles as just sort of this industrial thing on the side these days, but the fact is that it was pretty much a foundation of all civilizations until very recently. And I loved how Postrel framed this rather than just diving into individual types of textiles and like the civilization that they're most highly associated with, like linen in Egypt and silk in China and wool in England. I mean, there is that kind of overview, but she goes much farther to kind of talk about the interconnectedness of a lot of this and how technological innovations in textiles spilled over to be so important in the rest of civilization as well. It's a fascinating read whether you are interested in like fiber arts yourself or not. This is actually kind of a nice little microhistory that explains why textiles are so important and kind of gives context for how weird it is that we have devalued clothing and textiles so much in the modern age. That's just bizarre given how important it's been until very recently. Every year there is at least one book that I intended to do a review of, and then it just never actually happened. And this year, that book is A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine. As much as I adored this book and I really wanted to talk about how it was similar but also different from A Memory Called Empire, which is one of my favorite books of all time, that review just never materialized. There's an outline, there are notes, I never filmed it. So maybe someday when I reread it, and that will absolutely happen. So yes, once more, my kind of science fiction about linguistics and communication and interspecies communication and first contact and different states of consciousness. It's great. I love this. Cannot wait for more by Martine. I kind of suspect that this is going to just be a duology and there won't be any more books, but if she ever wanted to return to this world, I would be on that in a heartbeat. Then one that I did actually do a review of, this is Blackwater Sister by Zen Cho. This is a contemporary fantasy novel set in Malaysia, and I loved it. This is, in my opinion, the best thing I've ever read by Zen Cho. I haven't read all of her work before, but this was such a good novel, such a good standalone, and I was impressed by pretty much every aspect of it. It was such a satisfying story, and I loved getting so into this different mythology and culture and the setting in Malaysia and everything. It was like taking a trip somewhere. So loved it, and if you want to know more about this, I did do a review of it. A Song for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. I feel like this book was kind of written for me in the head space that I was in 2021. I think it touched me so much because I read it at just the right time when I was going through some stuff, and there's this whole discussion in here about choosing what to do with your life, you know, if your job is satisfying, making a radical life change to, you know, pursue what you want, and just, yeah, deciding what you want for yourself. And I really needed that at the time that I was reading this. And it is also just cozy, comforting science fiction in a way that I think only Becky Chambers can really do sometimes. So I loved it. I want so much more. I want many, many continuing adventures with the monk and the robot. And lastly, for the favorite books of the year, I have Islands of Abandonment by Flyn. This is a nonfiction book, roughly speaking, about places in the world that have been deeply touched by humanity and then abandoned, places that have been bombed during like World War II or polluted and are extremely toxic. What happens to these places once we move on? Like, what is the world's capacity to heal the scars that humanity inflicts on it, pretty much? It is also surprisingly some really beautiful nature writing, and that's something that I really appreciate about this book, is that while it very much teaches about nature and how things can change and heal and surprise us, it's also like viewing some of the devastation and also the beauty in some of these places and the eeriness of some of these places. It was a really, really fascinating read. I read this, I think, back in November, so it hasn't been that long ago. And I think it will take a while for me to know how long this one is actually going to stick with me, but it made such an impression on me while I was reading it. And next up, I have 5 honorable mentions that I just couldn't go without at least saying something quick about them because they stand out in my year of reading. The first is The Disordered Cosmos by Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. This is a nonfiction book about basically the need for diversity and diverse voices in the sciences. It is about the prejudices that, you know, people of color and women, minorities experience in the sciences and how that is so detrimental. This book shaped a lot of how I viewed the science nonfiction that I read this year. This was a discussion that I really needed to be exposed to, and I kept thinking about it throughout the year, and I'm so grateful that I read the book when I did. I needed to hear what this book had to say. Then there is something just completely fun, and that is the 8 volumes of Hat Atelier that I read this past year. This series is by Kamome Shirahama, and it's translated into English by Stephen Kohler. I'm so glad that I picked up this series and stuck with it because it started out as just kind of sweet, almost too saccharine, and I wasn't sure if it was going to be super original, and then with every volume it has gotten more and more interesting. I am so engrossed in it now, and it's just been one of those bright spots that I look forward to. By far, probably the most beautiful thing that I read this past year, I mean like literally beautiful to the eye, was World of Wonders by Aimee Nezhukumatathil. I am actually blanking on the illustrator's name right now, which is so shameful because the illustrations elevated this little book so much. But this book kind of kicked off my interest in nature writing. It was so beautiful. Nezhukumatathil is a poet, and these little essays on on things that she found beautiful or noteworthy in nature. They read like prose poetry in many places. I was so impressed. I loved this. Someday I'll get a copy of it for myself, and I definitely need to pursue more nature writing now. Then there is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. This is one of those random books I picked up this year because other people were enjoying it and I couldn't put it down. So this is young adult historical fiction, though to be perfectly honest, I didn't realize it was supposed to be YA or that it was marketed as that when I read it. I approached it as an adult novel, and I think that's perfectly fine. And it is about the coming of age of a Chinese American teenage girl in 1950 San Francisco as she realizes that she is lesbian, and it was wonderful. I mean, talk about an audiobook that I just like, I was inventing reasons to do things so that I could listen to the audiobook rather than like have to put it down. It was such a good story. I feel like it's the kind of story that a lot of people really need to hear. It was touching, it was satisfying, it was really good historical fiction, and I loved it. And my last honorable mention, my last favorite book of the year, is The Witness for the Dead by Katherine Addison. This is the long awaited companion to The Goblin Emperor, and I adored it. I did a whole review of this where I talked about it in relation to The Goblin Emperor and how I think it is very different but still just as satisfying, and I'm so happy that there's already a sequel announced for it. This was another one that was a very emotional story, very touching, and one that gave me all the feels, and I felt so comfortable while reading, and I think that says so much about last year, basically. So that is it. Those are all of my favorite books that I read in 2021. Obviously there are many more things that I really enjoyed, but if there's anything I had to say about this last year, this is going to be kind of depressing, but it is what it is. Last year was kind of like the accumulation of all of the trauma and the stress of like the past 2 or 3 years, and that affected my mood and not necessarily what I was reading, but how I reacted to what I was reading. It was surprisingly hard to like make a favorites list this year because even though like intellectually I know that I enjoyed things, there was just so much going on that I feel like it cast this kind of like dampening effect across all of my emotions and my memories of the year. And it's not fun, but it is what it is. And it is nice to look back on these books and realize like there were so many good things that happened last year. There were things that I enjoyed, so many books that I hope to revisit in the future, and that is exciting. I hope for even better things in 2022, though it will be a very different year, I'm sure. It's not going to be worse, I'll say that. So let me know what you thought about any of these books. What were some of your favorite books of last year? Do let me know in the comments down below. I'll be back to talk to you again, hopefully soon. Cross your fingers about my reading statistics for 2021, which is my favorite geeky video to make. And until then, Happy New Year and happy reading.